Hi, and welcome to the CDFM study group as we continue the review of CDFM Module 2.1, which is Defense Budget Process. This section accounts for 60% of the exam, so pay close attention to the information. We're going to pick up on page 2.1.30, which is the 3 DoD decision support system, 3 systems that Department of Defense uses to determine requirements and then determine the best method to pay for those requirements to fill our capability gaps. So again, the 3 systems are, please learn them in this order. JCIDS, Joint Requirements, Oversight, Joint Capability, Integration, and Development System, which is JCIDS. The second system is the PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget Execution System, and the third being Defense Acquisition System. So JCIDS identify capability gaps, looks at what we have in our inventory versus what we need. Then it determines our solution to fill that gap or to fulfill that requirement. How do we get those requirements resourced through the use of the PPBE process? Then if it's a material, equipment that we need to develop, something we need to develop, do we need to then engage the defense acquisition system to do so? So those 3 support systems consistently overlaps. And if you look at the chart on page 30 in the center, it shows you that QDR we talked about earlier, quadrennial review, quadrennial report that is developed. And the QDR is basically the DoD strategy for how it handles business as required. All right, so we already know that we have resource constraints to deal with. So PPBE is a systematic process that we use to determine requirements, how to resource what is needed, and then what part of the cycle what fiscal year do we then request the funding. So on page 33, 2.1.33, it begins the planning process. Fiscally constraints, programmatic guidance accomplished, national defense strategy, incorporate DoD goals in the quadrennial report. All that's saying is the same thing that I showed you on that chart. So there are 2 key elements in the process. That's the bottom of page 33. So who did we say was responsible? Because I said it on the earlier slides. Who is responsible for the Department of Defense planning phase? That's the USD for policy is responsible for the planning phase. So you kind of have to, as you're moving along, always pause and recap the information you've already studied to see where things and how these key individuals fall into place. So let's see what we have here. At the bottom of page 33, that first paragraph, last sentence, the result of the planning phase is fiscally constrained programmatic guidance to accomplish the defense strategic guidance and the corporate defense goals in the QDR. The 2 key elements, defense planning guidance, and sometimes you may see it because I've had individuals who said on their test, this used to be called the Defense Planning and Programming Guidance, DPPG. So in the event you see that DPPG versus Defense Planning Guidance, please note that they are the same thing. They just name. So although the old study guide has DPPG, the new one has DPG. I've had individuals as recent as a month ago who said that the information from the old study guide was on their test. So don't be alarmed, they mean the same thing. So you also have strategic portfolio review, and you can read through that. So taking it over to page 34 talks about some more about the national security strategy, which we've already extensively talked about. And from the national security strategy, DoD determines its strategy, with the quadrennial report and all those other documents associated with the QDR, and also the final document that is published by the DoD at the end of the planning phase is that defense planning guidance. So if you look at the bottom of page 34 at the last paragraph, remember what I just mentioned about the DPPG? Look at how sneaky they are, right? So it says, in several previous annual cycles of the PPP process, efforts were made by the OSD to combine the planning and programming guidance in a single document known as the DPPG. But for the most recent cycles that has proven too difficult, OSD therefore has reverted to issuing only a defense planning guidance as the final document in the planning phase. So the DPPG, Defense Planning Programming Guidance, is the same document that as the defense planning guidance that is used today. So the final document in the planning phase is the DPG or DPPG. All right, so let's talk about when does the planning phase begin. So on the page 2.1.35, the process, it says, the second paragraph, the process begins when the combatant commanders provide the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Staff with personal appraisals. So what is that document called? Because we discussed that earlier also. What is the document submitted by the chairman? So they're not just saying, hey, this is what we need. There's a document that the combatant commanders submit to the Secretary of Defense that tells them what the requirements are. And that document is called the IPL, Integrated Priority List. So the combatant commanders submit the IPLs, you can put that in there yourself, to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Staff. That is when the planning process begins, about a year and a half advance of the fiscal year in which the budget is going to be needed. So these analyses are based on the following documents that we've already touched on. QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, Defense Strategic Guidance, National Military Strategy we talked about, that is written by, again, the word military strategy tells you somebody in uniform wrote it. So it's the Joint Chief of Staff and the Joint Planning Document, Military Department's long-range plan. So the joint planning document, we didn't touch much on it, but basically joint tells you it's from each of the services. That's that one document that says, this is what needs to be done. This is a strategy. This is what Army needs to do, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and so forth, joint. And then specific to that military department is they have their own long-range plan. Think again about the op order example. So National Security Council op order is a national security strategy. DoD takes that op order and develops the National Defense Strategy in the quadrennial report. That is the DoD's op order. And then the military departments begin their plan, which is the military department's long-range plans. So the focus of planning on the bottom of 35, the focus of planning is on the following objectives: defining the defense strategic guidance and the national military strategy. All that is saying is, when I'm doing my planning still needs to be in line with the National Defense Strategy, whatever guidance I receive from higher. Just like when I'm doing my own op order, my op order requirements must be in line with my higher command. There's no difference there. All right, let's go on the bottom of page 2.1.36. So on 2.1.36, you see it talks about the joint strategic planning. You can read through that. It's just information there. What I want to point out at the bottom of page 36 is under the Joint Chief of Staff and the combatant commanders. So it talks about the primary interaction between combatant commanders. So I remember I said earlier, operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. That's how the military departments are set up on the Department of Defense. However, when it comes to operations that are happening and the mission of the Department of Defense, that's the operational chain of command. But communication, so primary interaction between the combatant commanders and the military department is through the various component commanders. So combatant commands, with the exception of special operations, do not submit their own POM, Program Objective Memorandum, or budget estimate submission. So those in NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, although they have requirements, remember the only document they submit their requirement, integrated priority list, to the component commanders or the military department responsible for inclusion into their POM, inclusion into their budget. So that's what it's saying at the bottom of 36. And it mentions again the integrated priority list. So anytime you see the IPL, automatically your mind should go to combatant commanders. That's what they detail their requirements. And if not, go to page 37. It talks more about the IPL. IPL, integrated priority list, combatant commanders, high priority needs. Sends a copy to the SecDef, chairman of the Joint Staff, military department responsible for it. So the intent of the IPL is like giving the military department a heads up, giving everybody a heads up. I am in charge of AFRICOM, and these are my requirements. This is what I'm submitting to hire, so everybody gets a copy. They get a heads up. They get visibility on what the key priorities are for those agencies. So again, planning phase. On page 38, the decision-making forums. So just like whenever let's picture you submit an evaluation or an award for someone. It goes up to one level, they mark it up, send it back to you to fix. You fix it, you send it up, it goes to another group, they don't like something, they send it back. So the same thing, when you send your requirements forward, it goes through different groups and forums listed on page 38. So when you submit your POM requirements or budget requirement, it goes through the 3-star program review group, the deputy management action group. These are just different groups that reviews the information submitted. And their function is to make sure that everything is fiscally correct and in line with the plan that is being put into place. The bottom of page 2.1.38, Secretary of Defense make the final decision. So remember and let's see what we miss here. Okay, so you can read through that on page 38. So that's the end of the planning phase of P. And what I mentioned is the USD for policy, under Secretary of Defense for policy, is responsible for the planning phase of P. That means you need somebody, the action officer, for lack of a better word, is the USD policy. Because on page 39, we're going to move into the programming phase. And you have a different action officer responsible for the programming phase of the P process. All right, so after the plan has been put in place, then programming phase says, the purpose of the programming phase is to translate that plan, programming guidance, and congressional guidance into detailed allocation of resources. So we need to then prioritize based on the plan. We need to use the programming phase to determine when do we need this item. We need to program it, prioritize it based on the needs. So that's what the programming phase comes into play. So the programming phase translates planning decisions, Office of Secretary of Defense programming guidance, and congressional guidance into comprehensive detailed allocation of forces, manpower, and funds. The program executive officers for manpower, operation and maintenance, housing construction, and so forth incorporates their requirements into the process. The second to last paragraph. During the programming phase, the primary interaction, again, between the combatant commanders and the military department is through the component commanders. That's the same thing it's saying here as it did in the previous page. So combatant commanders communicate through combatant component commanders. Yeah, I get those mixed up sometimes too. All right, so I'm looking at the top of page 2.1.40, compilation and submission of DoD POM estimates. In the late May or early June timeframe, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller and Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluations send an integrated program budget review guidance document and provides detailed schedule and guidance. Okay, these instructions are in addition to guidance found in the Financial Management Regulation, so DoD Regulation 7000.14R. So if you just took Module 3, this was something that I pointed out for the finance section and the accounting section. Always reference the DoD FMR 7000.14R. All right, so the first question, since we're talking about the programming phase, who is responsible for the programming phase at the Department of Defense? That's the Director of CAPE, DCAPE, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So going back at the top of 40, they mentioned the DCAPE. So first of all, planning is a USD policy, programming, Director of CAPE, and then I told you budget and execution is the function of the USD Comptroller. So that's what is being stated here, is sometime between May and June of each year, the Director of CAPE, that's the POM process, and the budget process, which is the USD Comptroller, issues an integrated program and budget guidance. So before we start the POM process, before we start developing our budget requirements to submit to hire, we need to have guidance. So they issue that guidance between May and June of each year. So it mentions the POM on 40. DoD components develop their proposed programs consistent with specific guidance from the planning and programming perspective. 41. Upon receipt of each component's POM, the Office of Secretary of Defense, specifically the Director of CAPE, because he's responsible for programming, updates the future year defense program. So the FIDEP, this is the only time you will hear the word database associated with the future year defense program on page 41. Let's look at FIDEP, then I'll go back to the DCAPE statement at the top. So the Future Year Defense Program is the DoD's automated database that keeps track of all the forces, resources, equipment necessary to fulfill a particular requirement. So one of the most vital components, a foundation of PEEB, is the Future Year Defense Program. FIDEP is an automated database that summarizes all forces, resources, and equipment associated with programs approved by the Secretary of Defense. FIDEP contains our total obligation authority, 10 years of data identified as prior year, current year, and we're going to look at all of that again when Congress is enacting the various budget. So the FIDEP is usually updated to coincide with submission with the budget. So typically your programming phase and your budget, because budget we're usually asking for a budget about 18 months out, that budget phase start. So P process, remember how that thing overlaps even in the PPBE process. because of the timeline of our appropriations and when they expire. So at the top of page 41, it's saying the DCAPE, who is responsible for the programming phase, is also responsible for updating the future year defense program, which is that database. So there's a picture on page 42. I love pictures because it's easier to remember. So what the picture is saying, on the left side, you see the 11 major force programs. At the top, you see various DoD appropriations, and at the right side, you see the components, Army, Navy, Air Force, and so forth, defense agencies. So what the FIDEP is a database that keeps track. So every function of the Department of Defense falls under one of those 11 major force programs. That's how, if you can picture our missions, all of our missions fall somewhere in one of these 11 categories. So it's saying it ties together our mission, our major force program, utilizing various appropriations to complete the missions of the various components. Let's see, I have some notes on 42 at the top. After the president's budget is submitted to Congress, by law, that budget is due no later than the first Monday in February for the fiscal year to begin that following October. So let's look at where we're at. Today's date, we're in the month of November, which meant that this particular fiscal year budget was submitted by the president, or by law, it should have been submitted to Congress no later than this past February for October of this year. So that's what it's saying here. So by law, president is required to submit the federal budget to Congress no later, so it could be earlier, no later than the first Monday in February of that year prior to that October. Also, at the bottom of the Future Year Defense Program, let's read what it says, midway of that. The FIDEP is arranged using the appropriation terminology in the president's budget and is used by Congress to review the budget request and enact budget authority through the authorization and appropriation process. The third dimension displays the DoD component. So they're just trying to explain that Rubik's Cube look that you see there. So if you look at the picture, 11 major force program, various appropriations used to fulfill those programs, and they're not directly aligned because you can use any appropriation in any category used by the various components. All right, so on page 43, it says, okay, when we submit our POMs to the Secretary of Defense, somebody needs to go through all that document. So POM programming, because it's the responsibility of the Director of CAPE, Director of CAPE has teams of individuals that reviews our POM submissions. And then whatever questions that arise out of it, they are issued and compiled in what's called an issue book. So that's what you see, issue books listed at the first paragraph under programmatic issues and program review. So those particular issue books are then, it's more like a command summary or commander summary of what all those documents, I mean, the Secretary of Defense don't have time to go through all of our paperwork. So those issue books will then identify what questions they have that come out of that process. So on page 2.1.44, we're still on the programming phase. Also, when it goes to the Secretary of Defense or to OSD, what it's saying here on page 44, again, coming from the military, is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff also reviews our submission. Make sure that we are in line with whatever the military guidance is for the requirements that we're asking. Is that in line with what we need? So the chairman provides an assessment And I will also say his recommendation on our submission. So when we submit our POMs, it goes to the Office of Secretary of Defense. It is reviewed by the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and also reviewed by the Director of CAPE. The final document that DoD issues, once DoD has made a decision on the programming phase that they're going to submit forward, the document that is issued is the Resource Management Decision, RMD. So the RMD is what completes the programming phase, and it actually completes the budget phase because they're done at the same time. So you have an RMD for program and an RMD for the budget phase. So what was the final document for the planning phase? The Defense Planning Guidance / Defense Planning Programming Guidance, whichever word they choose to use. The final document for programming to say that the DoD has made their final decision. That means you can picture the in between, those issue books, those questions that had to be answered was answered, decision was made in the Resource Management Decision, the final document issued by the Department of Defense. And that then will conclude the programming phase of the P process. All right, so let's move to 2.1.45, which is the budgeting phase of P. So who's responsible at the DoD for the budgeting phase? The USD Comptroller, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. So 45 says the final phase of the preparation of the federal budget or the president's budget, so it may either be called one of those, is the translation of the program. So we have the program, then now we need to translate that requirement into an appropriation. So now we need to get specific on how much O&M, how much construction money do we need, how much military personnel functions do we need, funding do we need. So the budgeting phase then translates our program into an appropriation. And so that's what it's saying there. In the lay, budget estimates, compile, Director of CAPE. And we talked about, I'm reading the paragraph under compilation and submission of DoD budget estimate. It's the same thing as the programming, because I said in May, June timeframe, the Director of CAPE, who's in charge of programming, and the USD Comptroller, who's in charge of budget and execution, will then submit an integrated program budget review guidance. Before we actually start doing any legwork, they give us the guidance sometime then. So in 46, it talks about the budget estimate submission, the BES, BES. Each DoD component submits a budget estimate submission to OSD no later than the due date specified in the integrated program budget review. So part of the guidance is to give us a timeline in when our submissions are due. The BES and POM from each component are submitted together concurrently. Additional budget submissions. Following the initial budget estimate submission, additional budget submissions may be made where warranted by specific changes in circumstances. So remember, this whole process, even the POM process, might be 2 years, had started 2 years before the actual budget submission was submitted. So things may have changed. And so what this is just saying is we may need to update those changes when we do our submission. So on page 47 talks about the OSD/OMB. So if you notice, that's why you have to pay attention, is they just give you the acronym OMB. So you have to remember who that key player is. So OSD stands for Office of the Secretary of Defense, and OMB is Office of Management and Budget. The OMB is the resource manager at the executive level. The President's budget chief financial officer is OMB. OSD is at Secretary of Defense Office. So following an initial scrub or review of a component's budget estimate submission by the USD Comptroller, budget analyst, and some tentative adjustments to that request, that analyst and a senior OMB representative jointly meets with one another to discuss that budget submission. And if you notice, which is also known as the fall review, the component representative answers questions. So during the fall review is when a member from OMB and Office of Secretary of Defense sit down to go over the budget request. Before you submit it forward and things go back and forth, it's best that you sit down together. So on page 48, it mentions, it mentions that last document, the last paragraph. So the decisions reflected in the RMD, integrated, concurrent with the POM, are also recorded in the Comptroller Information System. So remember when we were updating a system, when we did the programming phase, we were updating the future year defense database. On the budget side, while we're going through the budget updates, an additional automated system, it doesn't use the word database, so that's why I say Future Year Defense Program is the only one that used the word database. But on the budget side, the budget information is updated in the Comptroller Information System listed at the top of page 49. So 2.1.49. So the automated CIS is also used to prepare our budget. So all our budget information is there. So think of USD Comptroller finalizes the budget. Budget is reviewed by our OSD and our OMB member. The final decision, final budget is a resource management decision and is updated in the Comptroller Information System.